Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Hilf, Herr Jesu, gelingen, very similar title to yesterday's chorale, which translates to Help us, O Lord, behold, we enter. A couple of interesting moments in this chorale, all things considered very similar to yesterday's chorale, so we're going to see some of the, some overlap. Before I forget, this natural was just a mistake made by my engraving software. It's still an E flat here. And other than that, it's a fairly straightforward analysis, so we're just going to hop right into it. One flat in the key signature. We start on G minor, we end on G major, so similar to yesterday's chorale, we have G minor, but it's only marked by one flat in the key signature. Kind of continues this commentary that Bach uses key signatures for practicality's sake, so we use E natural in equal proportion to the E flat, so we'll see some E flats written manually here, but we see a lot more E naturals when they do appear. We start off with a one chord G minor, passing tone in the bass, B flat with the same chord above it. It's just taking G minor and putting it in first inversion. And then we get root position G minor on beat 3, G, B flat, D, and G. We go to F sharp, A, D, and D. It's D major over F sharp, which is 5/6. Passing tones in the alto and the bass before we get D, D, F sharp, and D, which is just taking our chord, putting it in root position. Passing seventh in the tenor. We don't need to reiterate the Roman numeral here, just because it's the same. And then we get G minor, G, B flat, G, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. And then we go to G, E flat, A, and C, which is A minor 7 flat 5. It's 2/4-2. Resolves where we would expect, 5/6. I was putting parentheses there because it kind of feels like the harmonic rhythms on 1 and 3 here, but I'll just analyze it as if the harmonic rhythms on every beat. F sharp, D, A, and C. It's 5/6-5, so it resolves the way we would expect. 4/2 typically resolves bass down by step, root down a fifth, but we do get an unusual 4/2 resolution later in the chorale, which is unusual, atypical, and I'll talk about it when we get there. But after 5/6-5, we get G minor, G, D, A, and B flat, this A being a 9/8 suspension over the bass, still implying our tonic and root position. And then we get ready for our half cadence that sort of spells the structure of the cadences that we're going to see moving forward, where we have the chord on beat 1 and then a repeated version of that chord on beat 3. We know that 5 is being implied here, D, D, G, and A, but like many dominant triads in Bach's chorales, we see a 4/3 suspension over them, and we know that a 5 chord still being implied because the resolution happens on the next beat. Moving to the next phrase, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of B flat, and even though you could analyze this as a common chord modulation, I feel like with the cross relation, or I guess it's a cross relation, F sharp going to F natural here, sort of feels like its own separate idea in the key of B flat, and we start off with the B flat major chord, B flat, F, F, and D, tonic triad, root position. B flat's a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. Then we have A, F, C, and F, which is 5/6, F major over A, and then we get a bit of an unusual progression. We go from 5/6 to 4/6, G, G, B flat, and E flat, which is E flat major over G, and that takes us to A, F, C, and E flat, which is 5/6-5, F7 over A, and we would expect this to go to our tonic triad, which it does, B flat, F, C, and D, the C being a 9/8 suspension over the bass, but our tonic triad being implied regardless, kind of similar to what we see here. The same way that 4/3 suspensions are common over dominant triads in Bach, here we see a 9/8 suspension over a dominant triad, not always for tonic chords, but very common over root position tonic chords specifically. Then we go to E flat, G, B flat, and C. C minor 7 over E flat, that's 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially over in cadential contexts. We then have F, F, B flat, and C. B flat being a 4-3 suspension over the bass, but a 5 chords being implied. We just talked about this in the previous cadence. And then we have F, F, A, and C. This E flat being a delayed 7th here in the tenor, but still the resolution to our cadence. And then we cadence on B flat major, B flat, D, F, and B flat, tonic triad, root position. Next phrase, in a very similar fashion to the previous, we're going to modulate directly to the key of G minor. And the main reason why I feel like it's a direct modulation has to do with the cross relation here. I'm pretty certain that in previous analyses I've analyzed this as a common chord modulation with 3 going to 5, but in this context it feels like its own separate idea, and I think that they're both valid analyses. Kind of a sidebar here, it's not about being right or wrong, it's about being able to clarify or back up your claims with evidence, and I think that analyzing this as a direct modulation is totally valid because of the cross relations and the fact that it feels like its own separate idea. But there is also validity behind calling this B flat chord 3 in the key of G minor as well. We have seen 3 go to 5 as a progression, and Bach more commonly uses common chord modulations between keys. So there's, like I said, validity behind both claims. D major is our 5 chord in the key of G minor, D, D, F sharp, and A, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get B flat, D, G, and B flat, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. Something that just dawned on me is that this passing C down here kind of turns this into a 5-4-2 chord, C, and then the D major chord on top of it, and it resolves the way that you would expect it to, which is pretty cool, because we're used to 4-2 chords resolving down by step in the bass, and then the root being a 5th apart, or the roots being a 5th apart rather. We then move to A, E flat, G, and C, which is A minor 7 flat 5 in root position. G is a passing 7th, but a chord tone because of the way that the chord is being spelled. It is very possible that this is it could possibly be a 7-6 chord, just by virtue of the fact, oh wait, never mind, I'm misreading this. I thought this was an A, not a G. Yeah, this is an A minor 7 flat 5. G is a passing 7th, and like I just said, it is not a non-chord tone because of the way the chord is spelled. F sharp is a non-chord tone here, a little neighboring tone. And then G is a chord tone as well before we get F sharp, E flat, A, and C. I think this E flat's a 7-6 suspension over the bass, so you could make an argument this is F sharp fully diminished, but I think this is actually D7 over F sharp, which is 5-6-5. F sharp, D, A, and C. 2 typically goes to 5 anyways, so 7 and 5 being that whole step apart does make a difference in the overall way that you would analyze, but I feel like this makes a little bit more sense in terms of what normative progression you would expect in this context, and that's what usually breaks the tie if there is any room for debate or interpretation, is what is the most likely outcome based on trends and my experience analyzing the music. And we would expect this to go to our tonic triad, which it does, G, D, A, and B flat, again with that 9/8 suspension over the bass. G is a chord tone, G is also a chord tone, F sharp is a neighboring 7th, and then we get C, E flat, G, and C, which is C minor in root position. It's a 4 chord, and that takes us to 5, D, D, G, and A. This G being a 4-3 suspension over the bass. We know about that in dominant triads from how I explained it earlier. F sharp is our resolution, E is the little neighbor tone, a lower neighbor, and this is our half cadence in the key of G minor, this being a repeat of the previous chord, or I guess the resolution of the chord on beat 1. Next phrase continues the key of G minor. We end in a perfect authentic cadence this time. So we start the phrase with another D major chord, D, A, F sharp, and D. I'm going to reiterate the Roman numeral because it's a new line. As you can see with chords like this one, for example, or like just the cadence in general, if I see the same Roman numeral and there's no change to the structure, if it's on the same line, I just won't bother reanalyzing until we see a change in the chord. But here, I'm going to reiterate the Roman numeral because it continues on a new line, and because the I changes positions, it's just like a courtesy, and that's just a stylistic thing I've developed as I've analyzed. That's not consistent with how I analyze on the same line, so whenever it comes up I do feel the need to bring it up. But if you've watched my videos in the past, chances are you're familiar with me rewriting the Roman numeral here. Passing tones in the alto and the bass, and then we get F sharp, D, A, and D, which is D major over F sharp, just taking that 5 chord, putting it in first inversion. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Passing 7th in the tenor here before we get what we would expect to be G minor, G, B flat, G, and D, tonic triad root position. We then have A, C, G, and C. Bit of an interesting chord here. What we would expect is a 2-7 chord, A minor 7 flat 5, but with the absence of flat 5, we don't know if this is melodic minor or natural minor, or harmonic minor for that matter. So this could be a 2-7 chord or a 2 half diminished chord. All in all, doesn't make too much of a difference in terms of the function of the chord. It's just we don't know without the 5th of the chord. In this case, the 5th of the chord is an important contextual tone because it tells us the quality of the triad, because the difference between minor and diminished is the 5th of the chord, and if we don't have the 5th in the 7th chord, we don't know what quality the triad of the 7th chord is. But regardless, 2 does take us to 5, D, D, F sharp, and C, which is another incomplete chord. In this case, it's 5-7, and we would expect this to take us to 1, which it does, G, D, G, and B flat, G minor root position. Closing in on our cadence, we have C, E flat, G, and A. A minor 7 flat 5 over C. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. D is a passing tone. Then we have A, C, G, and A. Almost like another 2-7 chord, kind of similar to how it's incomplete here, but I'm not going to bother marking it. We do get the E flat here though, so I'm inclined to say that maybe this is like 7-5-3. All in all, not too big of a deal if that makes it into the analysis though, because it's the same chord that's really being played, it's just the bass that changes. Regardless, 2 does take us to where we would expect, which is 5, D, D, F sharp, and A, D major, root position, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on G minor, G, B flat, D, and G, tonic triad, root position. Okay, moving on to the next phrase, we end in a half cadence in the key of B flat here, and where we modulate is a bit of a it's a bit of a nebulous area. I think we modulate before we see the E flats, and then namely the reason why has to do with the fact that G minor is being voiced as a 7 chord here on beat 3, and it's less likely for us to see a tonic 7 chord than it is for us to see a 7 chord, like a 6-7 chord, for example. But the resolution is unusual, that's for sure. So we start off with G minor again, G, D, G, and B flat, some vocal rotation, but otherwise still a G minor chord. And I'm going to say this is where we modulate to the key of B flat, and it becomes our 6th chord. And then here on beat 3, it technically turns into a 4-2 chord, F with the G minor chord on top of it. So we'll change the figure bass, and we would expect 4-2 to go to 2-6, but instead of taking us to 2-6, Bach takes us to 4. E flat, G, and B flat, so it's almost like we're missing the root of the chord here, but the bass resolves the way that we would expect. I guess not exactly the way we would expect, because the bass appears to be leaping down a ninth here, but it's still a 4 chord. Sorry, it's a 4 chord. It's major because we're in the key of B flat now, but we would expect a 2/6 chord here, even though they have the same bass. They have different roots, so it is interesting to see how this 4/2 chord is resolving. Yeah, it's just unusual. Typically 4/2 chords resolve down by step and the roots are a fifth apart. But here we see down by step, but the roots are a third apart, which is atypical for sure. E flat is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get D, F, B flat, and B flat, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. And then we move to C, E flat, B flat, and E flat. Very similar to our previous phrase, we have this incomplete 7 chord. In this case it's C minor 7, so the context isn't as important, but this is an unusual progression for one main reason, and that's because of the next chord we go to. That is C, C, A, and E flat, which is a diminished over C. If you've watched my videos in the past, you'll know that 2 going to 7 is kind of a quirky progression because of all of the predominant chords, like 2 and 4 namely, but also 6 can function as a predominant chord, even 1 can function as a predominant chord, or 3, but typically 2 and 4 are what we see in cadential contexts. Of all of the predominant and dominant chord progression combinations, so 2 to 5, 4 to 5, 4 to 7, and 2 to 7, 2 going to 7 objectively is the weakest progression by tonal standards because of the fact that the roots are a third apart. It's the only combination where the roots are a third apart, and because of this the chords are largely similar, right? A 2 chord is C, E flat, and G, and a 7 chord is A, C, and E flat. So they both have that C and that E flat in common, which is not really the hallmark of a strong progression. It's like, this could be the byproduct of just one voice moving, and even though it looks like there's a lot of motion going on in the voices, the pitch content is largely similar. So even though this on the surface looks like a 2/7 going to 7/6 progression, and that's a valid analysis because that's literally what's happening, I think what might also potentially be happening here, maybe this is a Hail Mary, but this might be a 7/6 suspension over the bass here, C up to B flat, and then it resolves down. The bass technically stays the same from a pitch content standpoint, but the tenor changes, which makes this kind of look like a 7/6 chord as well. So whether this is a 2 to 7 progression, which is a valid outlook on what's going on here, or whether this is just a big 7/6 chord, I don't know. There's room for debate. All in all, doesn't make a tremendous difference to me. It's just stylistically speaking, in terms of how I analyze chord progressions, usually when there's 2 and 7 and they're in and around the same context as one another, usually 7 is the chord that makes most narrative sense. But after 7/6 we do get what we would expect, which is our tonic triad, B flat, F, B flat, and D. Also sort of contributing to this is the fact that we have a 1/6, 7/6, 1 progression. It is a little lopsided because the 7/6 is getting, I guess if we were analyzing it this way, 2 beats worth of stress. All in all, like I said, not super important. It's mostly minutia, but I do think that, if I had it my way, this would just be a 7/6 chord. But it is hard to argue that a progression isn't happening here with 3 voices moving. So this could be a more elaborate take on an otherwise one voice moving progression. If you've watched some of my videos in the past, chances are if you just pick a video randomly, you'll see a 1/6, 7/6, 1 progression in there somewhere. It's a very common progression in Bach. This is just a different take on it. But afterwards, 1 takes us to our cadential chord, which is F major, F, F, B flat, and C. And like I mentioned earlier, another 4/3 suspension over the bass. Very common for dominant triads to have a 4/3 suspension baked in somewhere. G is a neighbor tone, A is our resolution, and then we cadence on F. Last phrase, bit of a nebulous modulation here. There are a couple of different points in which we could say the modulation occurs. I would say that it happens after the secondary dominant to me, because when I hear F going down to E flat here, I expect to hear B flat major over D, right? Because F major going to E flat, like I talked about earlier, this 5 chord here, 5 with this passing 7th in the bass kind of turns it into 5-4-2. The same thing here, we have a 5 chord, the passing tone in the bass turns it into 5-4-2, passing 7th more specifically. This D with the D in the melody as well, I would expect an F natural and a B flat, but instead Bach throws us for a loop and we hear D major. So in terms of modulation, where I mark the modulation is actually at the G minor chord, and after tonicizing this G, which sort of feels like a deceptive progression for me, then continues in G minor. But it's also very valid to say that the modulation happens over the F chord too. Seeing 7 go to 5 is a progression that we've seen in the past as well. This is just a different interpretation, and this is just one of those cases where there are multiple valid analyses in my opinion. So we have 5 passing 7th in the bass, then we have D major in root position, which is 5 of 6, and then we go to G minor, G, D, G, and B flat, which is our 6th chord in B flat major, and our tonic triad in G minor, with another passing 7th in the bass. Kind of hypocritical of me to say that we've modulated to G minor by this point, when we see this passing 7th in the bass, which for the same reason kind of made this G minor chord feel more like we were in the key of B flat major. But I feel like all in all, where the modulation happens, this makes most sense in terms of the progression moving forward. This is a pretty wide modulation zone. You could really say the modulation happens at any point from the F major chord all the way basically until the end of the chorale. I would say probably before the D major chord, before the cadence though. To me this is just what felt right, and this felt more like a passing 7th rather than an entire chord where 4 voices are being sounded at the same time, not just suspended or sustained with one voice changing like it is in this case right here. So after 1 we get E flat, C, G, and C, which is C minor over E flat. That's 4-6, passing tone in the bass, passing tone in the tenor, and then we get C, E flat, G, and A minor 7 flat 5 over C. Kind of an unusual progression, kind of for the same reason that 2 going to 7 is not a very strong progression. 4-6 going to 2-6-5, not necessarily the strongest progression. I'd say the redeeming, or okay, I need to be careful with loaded terms like that, but the quality that I feel like makes this progression a little bit more on the normative side is the fact that we have E flat in the bass, which is the 6th of the G minor scale, and 6 wants to go to 2. It just so happens that Bach is using a 4-6 chord rather than a 6 chord. Could just be a sub, but we are doubling the C here, so it really does feel a lot like a C minor chord more than anything else. All in all, we see 4 go to 2 with relative frequency as well, so it's not like groundbreaking or anything, or like astonishing for me to see this. All in all, fairly straightforward progression, just a little bit less on the normative spectrum in terms of what we expect harmonically. We then have a passing tone here in the tenor before we get A, C, G, and A, kind of like a root position chord, like 7. This shouldn't be 7-5-3. This should just be 7-3. So if you've already written a comment about that, I beat you to it, or maybe you beat me to it. I don't know. But here, I guess you could make the argument that it is sort of like 7-3. Not typically the most. Oh, actually, you know what? I wrote 7-5-3 because we get the E flat on the end of the beat. That's why I was sort of looking at the big picture here with A, E flat, G, and A along with this C, and the same thing is sort of happening here, 7-5-3, where the chord briefly gets put into a root position-ish, kind of sorta, and we would expect this to go to 5, which it does. D, D, F sharp, and A, D major in root position, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we get G major, G, B natural, D, and G. Tonic triad, major tonic triad. Bach often ends his minor chorales with major tonic triads. I think it has to do with his relationship with major chords having a stronger sense of finality, or whether he wants to end the chorale on more of an uplifting note. All in all, it's mostly speculative, but it's pretty conventional for him to end his minor chorales with major chords. Not always, but a lot of the times. And that is today's analysis. I think the big takeaways are this unusual 7-4-2 progression or resolution, where we have 6-4-2 going to 4. We would expect this to go to 2-6, but after this also, the 2 going to 7 progression, the potential for 2 going to 7 is kind of unusual in my eyes. But then again, it's kind of veiled in this potential 7-6 suspension over the bass. Has potential to be analyzed just as a big 7 chord. So it's not the most exciting 2 to 7 progression we've seen, but the potential is there, and I didn't want to neglect that because this is a very valid analysis. That's pretty much all I had to say. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well, and like the video if you enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.